Welcome back. Now that you have been introduced to the playwright Aeschylus in an introductory form in the previous video, we're now going to initiate our series of videos on Athenian history as pertains specifically to the 5th century BC development of the Athenian polis, both the political and the military occurrences that become very important for the Athenians in the 5th century BC, and which influence the development of literature, especially tragedy, with Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and thereby the depiction of Greek mythology in those forums in Athens. I'm going to actually precede this description of the Persian Wars with some of the background that's helpful to know on the Athenian polis. And then once we've brought us down to the Persian Wars so that we can understand their genesis, then we'll discuss the Persian Wars in particular. The reason why this is important to cover in detail is that you remember from the video you just heard on Aeschylus that he served in the Persian Wars, both in Marathon and at Salamis, and included his military service on his gravestone, but did not mention anything about his service as a tragic playwright. So this is what really mattered to him. And this was, in fact, history-changing for the polis of Athens and for the Greek world as a whole. So it's important to understand in close detail what's going on here. I also want to preface this discussion with a special mention of the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. Aeschylus' first surviving play, Persians, referred to in the previous video, and also on the handout you looked at, the Persians depict this particular battle, the defeat of the Persians under King Xerxes at the Battle of Salamis from the Persian point of view. So this is the only time that we have the enemy's point of view in one of these Greek tragedies, which is describing a piece of historical fiction that's quite unusual for Greek tragedy, since normally Greek tragedy restricts itself to mythological topics and not real-life historical topics as a whole. Aeschylus, in fact, had to get special permission to do that particular play. So the Battle of Salamis is depicted there. Its aftermath from the Persian standpoint as Xerxes stumbles home abject from the defeat and then has to mourn in a state of lamentation with the chorus to conclude that particular play. So again, we need to understand the history of that so we can see the ramifications and realize why it matters so much that it becomes the object of a play by Aeschylus. Okay, so let me quickly run through some of the background on the polis of Athens itself in order to understand how we got to this point where they were fighting the massive empire of the Persians. So Athens was originally a kingship many years ago, and you saw previous references to King Theseus way back in early chapters of the Harris-Platzner textbook. Its first appearance of anything that resembles a democracy comes up in the year 684 BC, when for the first time Athens has a series of 9 archons who are elected annually and who run different aspects of the Athenian polis, such as the observance of religion, the training of all the military branches, as well as the maintenance of anything military related, like the fleet eventually. Then there's all the city administration, and then there's also all the laws. So those 9 archons govern all of those. Now, 684 BC, therefore, is the first point at which we see a departure from the original monarchy that had obtained in Athens prior to that. The year 594 BC is our next important year, although I do need to mention a couple of things before that. There was an attempt at tyrannical rebellion in 636 BC by a man named Cylon, who fled to the Acropolis with all of his supporters, took over the Acropolis, held it prisoner, and threatened to take over the entire city government. What he was trying to do was to cut off the Athenians from their divine worship up on the Acropolis, as well as cut them off from their treasury that was also kept up there. However, the followers of Cylon were starved into submission, and he surrendered himself to the Alcmaeonid family in Athens, who promised that they would treat him mercifully if he surrendered. In fact, however, as soon as he did surrender himself and they came down off the Acropolis, instantly they were taken away and executed. That resulted in a curse that was imposed on the Achaemenid family and any of their descendants. And politicians, including the great Pericles, who were descended from the Achaemenid family, always had to deal with that curse being implicated against them for reasons why they should not hold high office in Athens. Pericles, of course, was able to overcome that in a really stunning way. All right, well, after that rebellion, the next development in government is 620 BC, which is when a politician named Draco, probably not in direct response to the rebellion in 636, but maybe perhaps thinking of it from the past, put forward a series of laws with very severe penalties for practically every crime that might occur in Athens, basically a penalty of death. It is from this law code of Draco that we get the term draconian in English, referring to an excessively harsh law code with much too strict penalties. So that did not work well at Athens. Because, in addition to the severity of the penalties, it was not at all good that the Athenians continued to suffer with a great deal of inequity in their polis, with very wealthy types up at the top being able to hold office and conduct business in any ways they wanted to, and then a group of very poor people down below not being represented at all by the very wealthy types. So the politician who showed up in 594 BC as Archon, named Solon, changed the government around so that there were property classes that defined what level of property ownership every Athenian citizen had, and he redefined the rules for Athenian citizenship, plus also got rid of a lot of debts that the Athenian farmers especially had toward wealthier Athenians. So he did this in order to try to establish a certain amount of equity between the wealthy citizens and the poorer citizens, especially with regard to holding office. It turned out, however, despite Solon's best efforts at establishing equity in the classes, it wasn't sufficient, and eventually more infighting happened, and out of the infighting came a tyranny run by Pisistratus. Remember that a tyranny refers to a form of government that occurs when a leader supplants the government that already existed, replaces it extra legally, but it does not necessarily mean that that leader himself is a bad leader. It simply means that the previous government is abolished and a new leader comes into place. So Pisistratus in the mid-6th century BC was in fact a formidably superb leader of Athens who advanced a lot, among other things, the patron of the as patron of the arts, all of the different literary forms with music and art and architecture and such, did quite a bit to rebuild and beautify the city of Athens, and also got the important island of Delos out in the Aegean Sea by purifying it religiously under Athenian political control. So that was very effective, but Pisistratus' son Hippias and his brother Hipparchus, when they took over after Pisistratus' death in 527 BC, ran the tyranny quite effectively until there was a rebellion against it with an assassination attempt in 514 BC, whereupon Hippias, whose son Hipparchus had been assassinated, suddenly became very harsh and domineering, like a real tyrant, the way we think of it. Eventually, he was ejected from his rule, and a couple of years later, after further infighting, we get the actual democracy with Cleisthenes in 508 BC that forms the basis for Athenian democracy as we think of it. Now, the difficulty with all that, though, was that the Athenians had, in the meantime, also had some dealings with Persians along the way, including the fact that there was a big rebellion of Greek cities in the east against the Persian Empire, and the Athenians helped to support it. As a result, the Persians wanted to punish the Athenians for supporting those Ionian cities in their revolt in the early 400s BC, and that is what leads to these Persian wars, as we now understand it. So now we come to the Persian wars themselves. There actually were two invasions. One was by the first king Darius, and then the second was by Darius' son Xerxes after Darius' death. The first invasion by Darius actually started back in 493 BC and included within it a takeover of many of the islands in the Aegean Sea, including the very important island of Naxos, which was quite a large, wealthy island that also had a lot of the marble that the Athenians used in their own city. So that was a very unfortunate temporary loss for the Athenians. Darius then sailed in from the Aegean Sea into the northern part of Attica, where the plain of Marathon is from. Marathon, the name itself, originally refers to a shrub that grew there, but what happened was that somebody saw the Persians coming in and ran a distance of 26 miles to Athens, and that's in fact where the name Marathon comes today, referring to that type of a race. So the Athenians were in a state of having to decide how to respond to this invasion, and there were 10 generals in the new government. 5 of them wanted to fight, and 5 didn't. The one in charge of all of them was the Polemarchus Archon. One of the 10 generals was the esteemed Miltiades. He convinced the Polemarchus Archon, the one in charge of war, named Callimachus, to engage in the war with the Persians as they invaded their territory. The Athenians were vastly outnumbered against the Persians by land, but were nevertheless, with a series of tricks, were able to defeat, to everyone's astonishment, the Persians in the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, and they forced Darius to withdraw. Darius died in battle elsewhere a few years later, and so then Xerxes tried a second time to come in, and by that time the Athenians had the leadership of their very famous general Themistocles. He was the one who insisted, when the Athenians found some silver at a nearby mine, to use the silver to build up their fleet so that they would have a large sea force ready for resisting the Persians and spreading their own power after a time. So Xerxes came in with a big fleet, indeed, as well as an army. He actually engaged the Spartans, who tried to hold off the Persians, up north at Thermopylae in 480 BC. This is the famous battle that is depicted in the movie 300 with King Leonidas. Spartans, what is your profession? And so forth, up the northern part of Greece. The Spartans tried their best valiantly, but were betrayed by the hunchback. He wasn't actually a hunchback in real life, Ephialtes. And as a result, the Persians got the Spartans in a vice and were able to reduce the Spartans and push their way past. What happened because of that was the Persians got themselves all the way down into Attica itself and forced the Athenians under Themistocles to evacuate their city. So the Persians came in and destroyed most of it. That's actually the reason for a lot of the buildings that are dated to the 5th century BC on the Acropolis, including the famous Parthenon. They had to be rebuilt in the 5th century BC as a result of the Persian invasion that destroyed all the earlier buildings. So the Persians came in, but the Athenians evacuated and got themselves positioned on their fleet of boats all around the island of Salamis in 2 different locations near Troisdon across the Gulf and then around the island of Salamis itself. And Themistocles sent supposedly a secret message, according to the historian Herodotus, who depicts all of this, a secret message to Xerxes, trying to get Xerxes to come in. And Xerxes listened to the enemy, which you're not supposed to do, and he sailed in with all of his ships. And in a blockbuster effort, the Athenians pushed their ships into the Persian ones as they came in a trap, and the Athenians vanquished the Persian fleet and forced Xerxes to withdraw. Now, although the Persian fleet fled, the Persian army was still situated up in Boeotia, northwest of Attica, and it was there that the Persian leader Mardonius took on the Spartans there, because the Spartans came up from the north in order to protect Thebes and Boeotia from further Persian intervention. So the two sides were in opposition to each other all the time that the Athenians were engaging the Persians at sea. Eventually in 479 BC, there was an effort to maneuver part of the Persian army. Somehow an error was made in the way that the Persian army maneuvered around, and the Spartans were eventually able to take advantage of it by chasing after them. There was then a point where the Spartans pushed too far and the Persians had a chance to go after retribution. What finally happened was, according to Herodotus, that the two sides finally got into a major battle that was unexpected, and in this battle the Spartans vanquished the Persian army, and it fled as well. And that was 479 BC. That battle, by the way, is the one that's mentioned at the very end of 300. And in the meantime, the Athenians also defeated the Persians in another sea battle at Mycale over across east near Ephesus. As a result, the Persians finally withdrew from Attica and Boeotia completely. And although there were further skirmishes with the Persians, they never again posed the major threat of overtaking of the Greek world. And the Persians themselves were finally decisively defeated by the Athenian general Cimon, son of that Miltiades mentioned before, in 466 BC at the Battle of the Eurymedon River. And that finally put an end to the Persian threat. So it is this huge number of successes with the Persian wars that are celebrated for both the Athenians and the Spartans, but in particular with the Athenians in their literature with the playwright Aeschylus, especially in his play called The Persians. So in our subsequent videos on Athenian history, we'll start to get down into the Delian League, the network of allies that the Athenians set up with the Aegean islands and the cities. Gradually, we'll come further down into the way the Athenians under Pericles became really powerful and imperial in their reach. And then in much further videos later in the 5th century BC, we'll get down to the Peloponnesian War. Okay, thanks very much for all that, and we will see you next video.